Life in Maplewood Grove had always been comfortable for me. The neighborhood was the kind of place that developers boasted about in glossy brochures: quiet, tree-lined streets, a manicured park at the center, and families who waved to one another as they drove past. I had moved here 3 years earlier, buying a modest but beautiful 2-story house with a wide backyard. For me, it was the ideal place to raise my golden retriever. Max. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family. Loyal, gentle, and endlessly playful. He was known around the neighborhood as the dog who carried his own leash in his mouth when it was time for a walk. Children adored him, joggers stopped to pet him, and even the elderly couple across the street often slipped him treats. Max had become part of the community. Everyone seemed to love him. Everyone, except one person. Her name was Karen. From the day she saw Max running across the lawn, I could sense her disapproval. She had that look, arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes squinting through judgment. At first, I thought she simply disliked dogs. But it became clear soon enough that she disliked anything that wasn't under her control. Karen lived 2 houses down in a property that screamed perfectionism. Her yard was obsessively trimmed, her flower beds were lined with military precision, and her driveway was swept twice a day. Some neighbors admired her commitment to order. Others whispered about how exhausting it must be to live next to someone like her. For a while, I stayed out of her way. I smiled politely if our paths crossed and made sure Max didn't wander onto her pristine lawn. But one quiet evening in early summer, I received my first taste of the storm to come. It was a Saturday evening. Max had been lounging in the backyard, half asleep in the soft grass, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find 2 uniformed police officers standing there. Confused, I invited them in, and they explained that a noise complaint had been filed. Apparently, someone reported excessive dog barking coming from my property. I was stunned. Max rarely barked, and when he did, it was brief, usually when a squirrel crossed the fence. That night, he had been silent, save for a playful bark or two when the mail truck drove by. I invited the officers to the backyard, where Max wagged his tail and licked their hands. They chuckled, clearly realizing the absurdity of the complaint. After a brief apology, they left, and I thought the matter was over. But at WSN over the next 2 weeks, it happened again. And again. Each time, Karen had called the police, insisting that Max was a public nuisance. The officers grew increasingly apologetic, but it was clear they were obligated to respond to every complaint. It became a cycle. Karen would call, the police would arrive, Max would greet them like an old friend, and the officers would leave shaking their heads. What unsettled me most wasn't just the false complaints, it was the way Karen seemed to enjoy it. I would catch her peeking through her blinds whenever the police cars pulled into my driveway, her expression smug and self-satisfied. She wanted me to feel harassed, cornered, and unwelcome. For a while, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that if I stayed calm and patient, she would get bored and move on. But Karen was persistent. She escalated her campaign. Soon, she wasn't just calling the police. She began filing complaints with the HOA. The letters started arriving. Violation notice. Excessive noise from pet. Each one carried the threat of fines, hearings, and possible legal action if the disturbance continued. I tried to reason with the HOA board, explaining the situation and even providing written statements from other neighbors who confirmed that Max was not a problem. Some board members were sympathetic, but rules were rules, and the complaints had to be investigated. By the 3rd notice, frustration had set in. I began to feel trapped in a surreal battle. My loyal dog, who had never harmed anyone, was now being painted as a menace. My home, once a place of peace, felt like it was under siege. I could see the effect on Max, too. Though he couldn't understand the politics of neighbors and HOAs, he sensed my stress. He would tilt his head at the sound of police radios or grow uneasy when I sorted through another HOA notice. He knew something was wrong, and it hurt me to see him unsettled. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching Max chase fireflies, I realized I couldn't let this continue. Karen wasn't going to stop on her own. The police calls, the HOA notices, the constant tension. This was a campaign designed to break me down until I either surrendered to her will or moved away. But I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. The seed of an idea began to form in my mind. What if I could turn her own obsession against her? What if, instead of hiding from the spotlight she was trying to shine on me, I stepped into it brightly, boldly, and in a way she never expected? It wasn't going to be enough to simply defend myself. If Karen wanted a battle, then I was going to make sure I had the last laugh. And so, quietly, patiently, I began planning my revenge. The first step in any battle is understanding the enemy. By now, I knew Karen well enough to predict her next moves. She thrived on control, on the illusion that she was the guardian of neighborhood order. Every trimmed hedge, every freshly painted fence, every HOA bylaw was, to her, a weapon to wield. She didn't just enforce rules, she lived to see others bend beneath them. Her obsession with Max had little to do with noise. It was about power. She had decided that my dog was a problem. And in her mind, that meant he was a problem. That was all the justification she needed to launch her campaign of complaints. If I wanted to end this, I needed to undermine her power, not through confrontation, because Karen thrived on conflict, but through exposure. I needed to reveal her pettiness in such a way that the very community she sought to control would turn against her. The idea crystallized one night as I scrolled through neighborhood forums and community pages. I saw photos of families posting about block parties, lost cats, garage sales, even holiday decorations. It dawned on me. People loved sharing stories about the neighborhood. And if there was one thing Karen hated more than losing control, it was being laughed at. That was when the plan began to take shape. I started small. On a quiet Saturday morning, I brought Max into the backyard and set up a few cameras, simple security cameras I had bought years ago but never installed. This wasn't just for safety. It was for evidence. If Karen was going to keep filing false complaints, I would have undeniable proof that Max wasn't the noisy menace she claimed he was. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I wanted to do more than prove her wrong. I wanted to humiliate her in the way she had tried to humiliate me. So I turned to creativity. With a little research, I discovered that the city had very specific definitions of what constituted a noise violation. Decibel levels, duration, time of day, all meticulously outlined in official documents. I studied those rules like a law student before an exam. If Karen wanted to weaponize the law, I would wield it better than she ever could. The next step was making Max the star of the show. I began recording his daily routine, playing fetch, lounging in the sun, even snoozing with barely a sound. I clipped the videos together into short, cheerful montages, complete with playful background music. The result was undeniable. Max was one of the quietest, happiest dogs anyone could ask for. I shared the videos on the neighborhood's online page with a tongue-in-cheek caption, "Meet the neighborhood's loudest menace, my dog Max. Caution, may cause excessive tail wagging." The reaction was instant. Neighbors flooded the post with laughing emojis, supportive comments, and stories of how Max had brightened their day. Some even joked about wanting more barking because they loved seeing him. The community was rallying behind us, and though I didn't name Karen directly, everyone knew exactly who had been filing the complaints. That was strike one. Strike two was more calculated. Since Karen wanted to paint Max as disruptive, I decided to lean into the absurdity. I ordered a small speaker system and set it up discreetly in the backyard. At scheduled times during the day, I played faint recordings of barking, just enough to sound like it could be a dog, but low enough to stay well below the city's noise threshold. The beauty of it was that the barking wasn't coming from Max at all. He would usually be asleep inside while the speakers played. To any casual listener, it sounded like a dog, but to my cameras and soon, to the police who inevitably showed up, it was obvious Max wasn't making a sound. Sure enough, Karen struck again. Another call, another pair of weary officers at my door. This time, I led them straight to the backyard where Max was curled up peacefully in his bed. I showed them the cameras, the timestamps, and even the audio readings I had started logging with a decibel meter. They chuckled, shook their heads, and admitted their hands were tied, but I could tell they were beginning to lose patience with Karen. The officers left, but I wasn't done. I uploaded another video to the community page, this one a compilation of Max, sleeping while the faint barking played in the background. My caption was simple. Max is talented enough to bark in his sleep. Must be a world record. The comments section exploded with laughter. Neighbors joked about teaching their own pets silent barking. Others started sharing their own stories of petty encounters with Karen. For the first time, her reputation as the self-appointed watchdog of Maplewood Grove was crumbling. But I had one final piece of the puzzle to set in place. The HOA they had been breathing down my neck with violation notices, but those notices had all been based on Karen's complaints. I compiled a neat folder of my evidence camera footage, decibel logs, screenshots of community support, and requested a formal hearing. My strategy was simple: drag everything into the open. Make Karen defend her pettiness in front of them. Very bored she claimed to protect. When the hearing date was set, word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about it on morning walks, and I could see the anticipation in their faces. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about years of pent-up frustration with Karen's relentless need to control everything around her. The night before the hearing, I stood on my porch and looked down the street at Karen's house. Her blinds were drawn, but I could imagine her pacing inside, convinced she had me cornered once again. She had no idea that the trap she had set for me was about to snap shut on her. Instead, Max lay at my feet, head resting on my shoe, his calm presence grounding me. I knew that tomorrow would be the turning point. Tomorrow the battle would shift. Tomorrow Karen would face the consequences of her obsession, and as I turned off the porch light and headed inside, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was the one in control. The evening of the HOA hearing arrived like a storm cloud rolling over the neighborhood. Word had spread quickly, faster than I imagined. It wasn't just a formality anymore, it had become an event. Neighbors whispered about it during morning walks, parents murmured about it at the park, and even the retired couple across the street, who usually avoided conflict, admitted they planned to attend just to see what happens. When I stepped out of my house that evening, Max padded alongside me, tail wagging gently as though he sensed the tension but wanted to reassure me. The community clubhouse wasn't far, and as I walked, I noticed curtains twitching and neighbors leaning against porches, their conversations hushed. Everyone knew the feud between me and Karen had become a spectacle, and tonight they expected fireworks. The clubhouse itself was small but formal, polished floors, rows of folding chairs, and a long table where the HOA board sat like judges. In a court, papers were stacked neatly in front of them, along with the dreaded violation letters that had been landing in my mailbox. At the far end of the room, Karen was already seated, her posture stiff, her expression smug, as though she had already won. She was dressed with the precision of someone preparing for victory, hair perfectly curled, Laser sharp, lips pursed into a self-satisfied smile. Her eyes flicked to me as I entered, and for a moment I could almost feel the silent words behind them. "You don't belong here. You'll never beat me." I took a seat near the front, setting my folder of evidence carefully on my lap. My heart thudded, but my resolve was steady. This was what I had prepared for. This was the moment I had been building toward since the first. Police knock on my door. The HOA chairperson, a stern man named Mr. Blake, opened the hearing with the dry formality of someone who had done this dozens of times before. He explained the rules, reminded everyone to remain civil, and then summarized the issue. Repeated complaints had been filed regarding excessive noise from my property, specifically my dog. Karen's hand shot into the air before he even finished. She leaned forward with the eagerness of a prosecutor smelling blood. "I've lived in this community for over 20 years, she began, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And never before have I experienced such a blatant disregard for peace and quiet. That dog barks at all hours. It's impossible to relax, impossible to sleep, and I, along with others, should not be subjected to this constant disturbance." Her words were dramatic, carefully rehearsed, dripping with the authority she believed she carried. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one interrupted. Karen thrived in silence. It gave her the illusion of dominance. When she finished, she leaned back with a flourish, arms crossed, waiting for the board to nod in agreement. Instead, Mr. Blake turned his gaze to me. "Do you have a response?" he asked. I stood my folder in hand. "Yes," I said calmly. I began by presenting the camera footage. Clip after clip showed Max lying quietly in the yard, napping in the living room, or gently playing fetch, always calm, always silent. Each video was time-stamped during the exact hours Karen had claimed he was barking. The board members leaned forward, studying the footage carefully. Murmurs rippled through the room as neighbors recognized familiar scenes. Max lounging, the mail truck passing, the sun setting on the cul-de-sac. Then I introduced the decibel logs. Neatly printed charts displayed the noise levels around my property, meticulously recorded during the supposed disturbances. The readings were consistently below the city's threshold for a violation, lower, in fact, than the average lawnmower or passing car. Finally, I pulled out the community posts. Screenshots of neighbors commenting on how quiet Max was, how absurd the complaints seemed, and how much they loved having him around. One particularly popular comment, from a family 2 doors down, read simply, "If Max is noisy, then I must be deaf. He's the sweetest, calmest dog on the street." The effect was undeniable. Heads turned, whispers grew louder, and for the first time, Karen's confident smile faltered. She tried to recover, her voice rising. "Videos can be edited. Those posts are biased. People don't want to admit how disruptive he is because they like dogs, but I've heard him. I've heard him barking at 2 in the morning." I stayed silent, letting the weight of her words hang. Then, slowly, I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out my trump card, the speaker recordings. I explained, calmly and clearly, how I had set up a speaker system in the backyard, playing faint barking sounds while Max slept inside. I described how the police had visited multiple times, only to find Max perfectly quiet, evidence on video to prove it. The board members exchanged looks. A few chuckled under their breath, unable to hide their amusement at the thought of Karen calling the police on a sleeping dog. The room erupted into whispers and muffled laughter. Karen's face flushed crimson, her composure unraveling before everyone's eyes. She slammed a hand on the table. "This is harassment. He's making a mockery of the rules. You can't let this stand." But the board wasn't buying it anymore. Mr. Blake raised a hand, silencing the room. We've seen enough evidence to understand the situation. This board will deliberate and issue a ruling in writing within the week." His tone was firm, final, and laced with irritation, not at me, but at the endless drama Karen had dragged them into. The gavel tapped once, marking the end of the hearing. People began to rise, conversations buzzing around me. Some neighbors clapped me on the back, whispering words of encouragement. Others openly laughed at the spectacle they had just witnessed. The tide had shifted, and Karen knew it. I glanced over at her. Her eyes were narrow, her jaw clenched, and though she tried to maintain her composure, the cracks were visible. She had expected an easy victory, another chance to humiliate me, but instead, she had been exposed as petty, obsessive, and powerless. As I walked out of the clubhouse, Max trotting proudly at my side, I could feel Karen's glare burning into my back. I didn't need to see her face to know what she was thinking. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't, and she was right about one thing: this wasn't over. The days following the HOA hearing were unlike anything I had experienced in Maplewood Grove. What had once been a quiet, orderly neighborhood now buzzed with a single topic of conversation. Karen. It started slowly, like the first drops of rain before a downpour. A neighbor at the corner mentioned to me how entertaining the hearing had been, laughing about how Karen had insisted my dog barked while the footage showed him sleeping. Another neighbor shared a similar sentiment during a morning jog, telling me she had lived next to Karen for years and was relieved that someone had finally stood up to her. Word spread quickly. In a community where gossip usually consisted of lawn care tips and bake sale updates, Karen's meltdown at the hearing was irresistible. People retold the story with embellishments, some mimicking her voice, others recounting the smug look she wore before the evidence unraveled her case. By midweek, it felt as if every resident in the neighborhood had heard the tale, and for Karen, it was devastating. She had built her identity on being the enforcer, the self-proclaimed guardian of rules. For years she had wielded her sharp tongue and relentless complaints to keep others in line. But now her authority was cracking, and the community was beginning to question everything about her. At first, she tried to regain control. Flyers appeared in mailboxes one morning, cheaply printed sheets filled with long paragraphs about how community standards were under attack and how certain residents were endangering the peace. The language was dramatic, bordering on hysterical, and while she never mentioned me by name, everyone knew who she was targeting. But instead of restoring her image, the flyers had the opposite effect. Neighbors rolled their eyes, laughed, and tossed them into recycling bins without a second glance. Some even posted pictures of the flyers on the neighborhood forum, joking about Karen's newsletter of doom. I watched from a distance, amused, but cautious. The last thing I wanted was to appear smug or vengeful. I didn't need to push the narrative; the community was doing it for me. My job was simply to stay calm, let Max be his usual charming self, and allow Karen to unravel on her own. And unravel she did. One afternoon, I overheard her arguing with a couple walking their dog past her house. Her voice carried down the street, shrill and angry, as she accused them of letting their dog trespass on the public sidewalk. The couple laughed and walked away, shaking their heads. A few days later, another neighbor recounted how Karen had scolded their children for playing too loudly in their own backyard. Each encounter chipped away at her dwindling reputation. Meanwhile, Max's popularity soared. Ever since the videos of him had circulated online, neighbors treated him like a celebrity. Children would run up to pet him during walks, and even adults stopped to greet him by name. People joked that Max should run for HOA president. Some even asked if I would share more videos of him. So I did. I compiled another short montage: Max wearing a silly hat, Max napping under the sun, Max gently carrying his toy around the yard. I uploaded it with a cheeky caption, "Breaking news. The neighborhood menace strikes again with cuteness." The post went viral in the community group. Dozens of comments flooded in, praising Max and poking fun at the absurdity of the complaints. One neighbor joked about organizing a Barkayon fundraiser featuring Max as the guest of honor. Another suggested making him the official mascot of Maplewood Grove. The shift was undeniable. Where once Karen had commanded fear-through, her constant surveillance and complaints, she was now the punchline of every neighborhood joke. And nothing enraged her more than being laughed at. Her desperation became visible in her actions. I began noticing her pacing her front yard in the evenings, glaring at passing cars, scribbling notes on a clipboard as though cataloging every minor infraction she could find. Her blinds were rarely open anymore. When they were, I would see her watching, scowling, muttering under her breath. Then came the confrontation I had been expecting. It was a bright Saturday afternoon. Max and I were in the front yard, tossing a ball back and forth, when Karen stormed down the sidewalk. Her face was flushed, her steps sharp, each one carrying the weight of her anger. She stopped at the edge of my property, arms folded like a shield. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she snapped, her voice carrying down the street, turning everyone against me, making me look like a fool. Well, it won't last. People will see the truth eventually. They always do. Her words were loud enough that a few neighbors working in their yards looked up, curious. I stayed silent, refusing to engage. It wasn't worth feeding her fury. Instead, I bent down, picked up the ball, and tossed it to Max, who bounded after it joyfully. Karen stood there for another moment, trembling with frustration, before spinning on her heel and marching back to her house. The neighbors who had witnessed the scene shook their heads, some exchanging knowing glances. Karen had just embarrassed herself again, and this time she had done it publicly. That night, as I sat on the porch with Max at my side, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and caution. Satisfaction because the tide had truly turned. Caution because I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never admitted defeat. They clung to control until the bitter end. I didn't have to wait long to see how far she was willing to go. A few days later, a letter arrived not from the HOA, but from the city. It was an official notice of an emergency complaint filed against my property. The words were stark, bureaucratic, and laced with authority. Karen had taken her battle beyond the neighborhood, appealing to city officials in one final desperate attempt to win. I stared at the letter, my mind racing. Karen wasn't just embarrassing herself anymore. She was escalating. She was determined to drag this fight into a new arena, one where the consequences could be more serious. And in that moment, I knew the real showdown was about to begin. The letter from the city sat heavy in my hands, its crisp paper and formal seal making the situation feel more serious than anything the HOA had thrown at me. Unlike the hollow threats of fines or violation notices, this carried the weight of government authority. Karen had escalated. She had decided that if the HOA couldn't bring me down, she would. According to the letter, a city inspector had been scheduled to visit my property to investigate repeated noise violations caused by a domestic animal. The phrasing was cold, detached, but the intent was clear. Karen had filed one final desperate complaint, trying to bypass the neighborhood stage and bring the full force of bureaucracy against me. For a brief moment, frustration bubbled inside me. I had already proven my case. I had shown evidence, gathered support, and endured humiliation after humiliation orchestrated by her. Yet here she was again, determined to twist the narrative until she got her way. But after the frustration settled, something else rose up. Determination. Karen was playing her last card, and I realized this was an opportunity. If I handled it correctly, this wouldn't just end the complaints. It would expose her once and for all, in a way that even she couldn't talk her way out of. The inspection was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon. In the days leading up to it, I prepared meticulously. The cameras stayed running, recording every hour. I kept the decibel logs updated, making sure each reading was time-stamped and archived. I even contacted a couple of neighbors who had been most vocal in their support, asking if they would be willing to be present. Both agreed without hesitation. The morning of the inspection dawned bright and clear. Max lay stretched out on the porch, oblivious to the tension in the air. I busied myself in the yard, trimming a few bushes, tidying up the lawn, ensuring everything looked spotless. If the inspector arrived with even the slightest suspicion, I wanted to leave no room for doubt. When the city vehicle pulled up, Karen was already waiting outside her house. She had dressed with the precision of someone preparing for a courtroom battle, her clipboard tucked under one arm, her expression triumphant. She followed the inspector across the street, speaking animatedly, pointing at my property as though presenting a list of crimes. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a weary look that suggested he dealt with people like Karen before, listened, politely but non-committally. When he reached my driveway, I greeted him warmly, introducing myself and Max. "This is the alleged menace," I said lightly, gesturing to Max, who wagged his tail and licked the inspector's hand. The man chuckled despite himself, and in that moment I knew the tide was already turning. We began the inspection. The inspector walked through the yard, checked the fencing, and asked about Max's routine. I presented the decibel logs, the camera footage, and even the timestamps of police visits that had found no disturbance. Each piece of evidence was neat, organized, undeniable. Karen hovered nearby, growing more agitated with every passing minute. She interrupted repeatedly, insisting the barking was real, that the neighborhood was being terrorized. Her voice grew louder, shriller, until finally the inspector turned to her with a frown. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I can only act on verifiable evidence. So far, I've seen nothing to support your claims." That single sentence cut through the air like a blade. Karen's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing as though she couldn't decide whether to argue or retreat. She chose the former. "This is a conspiracy," she snapped. "He's tricking you. He's tricking everyone. That dog is a nuisance, and you're all too blind to see it." By then, several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, drawn by the spectacle. They stood quietly, arms crossed, watching as Karen's composure unraveled in front of the city official. Some exchanged smirks. Others simply shook their heads. The inspector turned back to me. "From what I can see, your property is in full compliance. I'll be filing a report stating there are no violations." Relief washed over me, but I stayed composed, nodding respectfully. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your thoroughness." Karen, however, couldn't let it end there. She stormed forward, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You think this is funny, don't you? Making me look like a fool in front of everyone. Well, this isn't over. You'll regret this. You'll all regret this." Her words echoed down the street, sharp and venomous. The inspector raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He made a note on his clipboard, gave Max one last pat on the head, and left without another word. The silence that followed was thick. Neighbors continued to watch as Karen fumed, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. For the first time, I saw not power in her eyes, but desperation. She had played every card she had, and still she had lost. Slowly, people began to disperse, whispering to one another as they went. The story of Karen's meltdown would spread quickly, another chapter in her downfall. That night, I sat on the porch with Max at my feet, reflecting on everything that had happened. The police calls, the HOA hearing, the flyers, the city inspection hit, had all led to this moment. Karen had exhausted every weapon in her arsenal, and all she had left was bitterness. Yet deep down, I knew one thing: she wasn't finished. People like Karen never simply walked away. When they lost control, they grasped at whatever scraps remained, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. And as I watched her lights flicker on across the street, her shadow pacing furiously behind the blinds, I realized the final act of this saga was still to come. Karen's last stand had failed, but her collapse was only beginning. Karen's house across the street had once been the center of attention. Her yard was pristine, her porch decorated seasonally, and her voice carried weight at HOA meetings. But after the city inspector walked away unimpressed, the cracks in her influence widened. What had once been quiet whispers of annoyance from neighbors now grew into open disdain. People had seen her at her most unhinged, and they hadn't forgotten. It started subtly. Where neighbors used to greet her with polite nods or forced smiles, they now turned away. The mom who lived 2 doors down stopped inviting Karen to the weekly book club. The older gentleman on the corner no longer offered to trim her hedges as a neighborly gesture. Even the HOA board, once her eager audience, grew weary of her constant tirades. But Karen refused to fade quietly. If anything, she doubled down. She marched door to door with fresh flyers, this time claiming that Max was a public health hazard, alleging allergies, bites, and imaginary attacks. Most people didn't even open the door. The ones who did simply shook their heads and tossed her papers in the trash. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became. And that isolation festered. From my porch, I would see her pacing at night, blinds snapping shut whenever she noticed me looking. She seemed restless, almost paranoid, convinced the neighborhood was conspiring against her. In truth, no one had to conspire. She had destroyed her own credibility with her obsession. Then came the final blow. It happened during the annual HOA summer barbecue, a tradition Karen had once prided herself on organizing. This year, she wasn't on the planning committee. She wasn't even asked to help. The event was held at the community park, complete with tents, music, and a bouncy castle for the kids. Practically the entire neighborhood showed up, myself and Max included. Karen, of course, couldn't stay away. She arrived midway through the afternoon, clutching a folder stuffed with papers, her expression tight with determination. She tried to corner the HOA president, loudly insisting that my dog was still a menace and that something had to be done. But instead of nodding along, the president raised his voice just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Karen," he said firmly, "we've investigated your claims again and again. The police, the HOA, even the city inspector. Each time, nothing was found. This needs to stop." The crowd grew quiet. All eyes turned toward her. Karen's face reddened as she waved her papers wildly. "You're all blind. You're letting him get away with it. That dog is dangerous, and you're ignoring the truth." But no one supported her. Not a single voice chimed in. Instead, murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Some people laughed outright. Others shook their heads in disgust. Parents pulled their children a little closer, not from fear of Max, but from Karen's spectacle. Max, sitting obediently by my side, only wagged his tail, oblivious to the storm around him. The image was almost too perfect. The dog she had spent months demonizing, calmly enjoying the day while she unraveled in front of the entire neighborhood. Karen tried one last desperate move. She shoved her stack of flyers at the HOA president, who promptly dropped them into the nearest trash bin. "Enough," he said simply, and with that, the dam broke. Laughter spread across the park. Not cruel, but collective, like everyone had finally been given permission to release months of pent-up frustration. Karen froze, her eyes darting from face to face, realizing she was no longer feared or respected. She was the punchline. She stormed out of the park, her footsteps heavy, her shoulders rigid. No one followed. No one tried to comfort her. She was alone. That evening, I sat on my porch again, Max at my feet, the faint sound of laughter from the barbecue still drifting through the air. The neighborhood had spoken. Karen's reign of intimidation was over. Over the following weeks, her presence dwindled. The endless complaints stopped. The late-night pacing ceased. She stopped showing up at HOA meetings altogether. Whether out of shame, exhaustion, or the realization that no one was listening anymore, Karen finally went silent. And in that silence, peace returned. Max dozed happily in the sun without fear of another police visit. Neighbors stopped me on walks, giving him treats and scratching behind his ears. The HOA, once a looming threat, now seemed almost laughable in its inability to be weaponized against me again. Karen had tried everything: calls to the police, harassment through the HOA, smear campaigns, even city inspections. But in the end, every move she made backfired, each attempt exposing her more until the very community she sought to control turned against her. She wanted me punished. She wanted Max gone. Instead, she had only managed to punish herself. The last laugh wasn't just mine. It belonged to every neighbor who had ever rolled their eyes at her flyers. Every parent who had been scolded for kids playing too loudly, every homeowner fined for petty violations. Karen had spent years policing the neighborhood, but when she chose me and Max as her final crusade, she overplayed her hand. The neighborhood was free, now free from her control, her endless complaints, her reign of pettiness. And I couldn't have scripted a better ending. As I scratched Max behind the ears and watched the sun dip below the rooftops, I thought about everything we had endured. The stress, the anger, the exhaustion, it had all led here, to this moment of quiet triumph. Karen had called the cops on my dog. She had dragged us through months of battles. But in the end, she lost everything, and I got the one thing she could never take from me: peace. And that, truly, was the last laugh.